My interest in Canadian politics is to a fault. Is it a niche little hobby of mine to be invested in the affairs of a foreign nation? My interest in this specific nation has caused me ridicule, embarrassment, and shame. People see me as a freak of some sort, as a worm. It makes me seethe, it makes me disdain the world. Of course, I'm kidding, but all jokes aside, Canadian politics are actually super interesting. I first got into it like last month, and everyone thinks I'm weird for it. I don't really know why. It's not like it was ever not interesting to me. I mean, I've always known some about it, like a few politicians. But for some reason, I just fell into a rabbit hole of parliamentary shenanigans and various political figures' lives. And I learned about how the Canadian government functions and the political culture of the various provinces. And in my amateur investigations, I slowly but surely began to theorize about the future of Canada. Lo and behold, as I was doing all this, I blew it way out of proportion, and now I have convictions and predictions I never thought I'd have. Whoa, slow it down there, bud. Hold your horses. I was just about to get to the explaining. Sorry about that, but what I'm trying to say is, don't judge me. Just hear me out. So many of you have probably heard of recent news in Canada. The finance minister, Chrystia Freeland, uh, resigned, leading the Liberal Party leaders calling for the resignation of this guy, because he kind of sucks and caused the poverty and economic struggle of millions of Canadians. Uh, Now this connects to my main theory, but it won't make much sense until you get a brief refresher on how Canadian politics and Canadian government actually work. So I'll catch you up real quick. So, all of Canada is divided up into 338 of these little areas called ridings, each with populations of about 100,000. And every 4 years, each riding elects a member of parliament, called an MP, and all the MPs come together to form the House of Commons, which is the legislative House of Canada. The leader of the party with the most MPs in the House becomes the Prime Minister. Prime Minister is the chief executive, uh, making the policies, appointing ministers to organize, fund, and carry out various areas of government. He is kind of like the president, except in the United States, the president is elected separately from the legislative branch, whereas um, there's an indirect election in Canada, wherein the legislative House of Commons elects the chief executive. The Governor General, this lady, is a person selected by the King of England who has a few very special powers. She selects the senators at the advice of the Prime Minister to represent the provinces of Canada in the upper house of Parliament, the Senate. The Senate does like laws and stuff, but I think it's really funny because the Senate of Canada is like extremely unfair and unbalanced. Like certain provinces have like hundreds of times more, hundreds or dozens of times more representation per person, or you know what I mean, just because of how it's distributed. Um, uh, and I just think that's really funny. They aren't even elected by the people, which is the funniest part. Um, the governor general doesn't do much, but one of her most important powers is that just randomly, like whenever she wants, at the snap of her fingers, based on any whim or interest, she can dissolve the entire Parliament of Canada and call a new election. Also, she can tell Parliament to convene and talk about boring law stuff. All right, this is just a system, but what is the actual political environment like? There are two, three, four, or six political parties in Canada, depending on how you count them. First, the only two parties who have had control are the Liberal and the Conservative parties. The Liberal Party is basically just the far left of the American Democrat Party, and they're super obsessed with the climate for some reason. Um, Not that it's bad, it's just weird how often it's brought up and when it is. And the Conservative Party, led by this dude, who everyone pronounces his last name wrong, is essentially all the economic parts of the American Republican Party, kind of like moderate left and moderate right. I don't know. It's like kind of a catch-all for everyone who isn't liberal. I don't know, it's um, now these parties are not uh, well, they're the only ones that have been in power, but that doesn't mean they're only ones with power. Canada has two possible kind of situate government situations. The first is majority party, majority government, when the ruling party also has more than half of the seats. So you can have the most seats, but still have less than 50%. Uh, but a majority government would be having more than 50%. And so the ruling party can pretty much do whatever they want. Um, and then, but a minority government, the other type, is when the ruling party has under 50%. So they need to make deals with other parties to get stuff done. This is only possible. It's only possible to have the most seats, but less than 50%, if you have a third party. Uh, so right now, the Liberal government and Justin Trudeau held the House by a majority. So there must be something going on to allow this. The third biggest party, well, technically the fourth biggest, but we'll get to that in a bit, in Canada, is the New Democrat Party, or NDP. It's headed by this dude. The NDP is basically a more socialist and supposedly less corrupt version of the Liberal Party. They're for like unionizing workers and all that. It's like working class socialist stuff. They only have like 30 seats right now, but it's still enough so that the Liberal Party and the NDP kind of have had traditionally like a coalition that allows the minority Liberal government to pass laws and actually get stuff done. But recently, because of the aforementioned problems with the Liberal government, the NDP has had a more strained relationship because Trudeau kind of sucks and they don't really want to be associated with him. The two smaller parties are the Green Party and the People's Party. Green Party has 2 seats right now and is headed by this weird old lady that they like worship for some reason. They're even more far left, and from what I know, I don't really know much about them. It's not really my interest. It seems like they don't really matter in the grand scheme of things, and that's more of just a. I honestly don't know what's happening with the Green Party, but they're like obsessed with the environment and stuff. The People's Party is kind of like the opposite. They have no seats, but they get like the same amount of votes, just in rural areas, so they can't like win any seats in Parliament. And they're on like the opposite end. They're just like less gay version of the Conservative Party. I don't. It's really the only way I could describe it. It's just they're also headed by some guy that they like are really obsessed with for some reason. It's just a weird. Both of them are really weird parties. Yeah. So I don't know if you noticed, but I've left out one party, and this is because this party is the main hinge that causes me to formulate this theory. It's the third biggest party in Canada. It is not defined by leftness or rightness, nor is it defined by conservatism or progressivism. Rather, this party is defined by radical separatism and hatred of the country they live in. Bloc Québécois is the national Quebec sovereignty movement in Canada. As you probably know, Quebec is the French-speaking province in Canada, and it has had a large separatist movement for many years. The Francophone community in Canada argues that since it's been segregated and marginalized from the majority Anglophone country for much of its history, they must in return push French language and Quebecois culture onto the rest of the nation. In an effort to separate Quebec from Canada, Bloc Québécois Party was founded, and it remains a significant portion of the House of Commons. Although the NDP gets more votes nationally, the Bloc is the third biggest party in the parliament because the votes are all concentrated in Quebec, and so they are able to win more seats. Now, Bloc Québécois has obviously never succeeded in its goals. In fact, it's never really been able to bring the issue to the forefront of Canadian politics. But it has come dangerously close. In 1995, a referendum for independence came within 1%, just barely voting no on the ballot. There was a 54,000 vote difference, which is a tiny margin compared to the near 5 million people that voted. Still, Quebec has never gotten independence. However, taking recent events into account, this might all change. Back to recent events. Justin Trudeau, according to any normal Canadian, was a complete failure, causing record-setting economic disparity, increased crime rates, unfettered immigration, and unjustifiably massive federal spending. Trudeau has soiled his father's name in many ways. The past 2 weeks, many members of his party and cabinet have turned against him, and with the resignation of Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland, most alliances formed between the parties have more or less dissolved. The next few months will be difficult for Canadians. A man almost universally hated is in their chief office, and a party they want out is in control. The polls prove this. The current House of Commons is ruled by the Liberal Party at 153 seats, as I said earlier, with the Conservative Party coming in at second at 120 seats. The Bloc and NDP fall far behind in third place and fourth place, respectively. These were the election results in 2021. The polls for next election in October of 2025 are drastic. So for context, the nation is very sick of high cost of living, drugs, and crime, and they will most likely vote the Liberals out of the running completely next election. 338 Canada, a polling website, projects that the Conservatives will receive approximately 45% of the popular vote, with around 20% each. The Liberals and NDP trail far behind, and not even a combined vote would pass the Conservatives in the popular vote. And finally, the Bloc will receive approximately 8% of the popular vote. Remember, though, votes do not win you an election in Canada. Seats do. Well, what are the parliament projections then? The Conservatives lead in the polls and the projections with a whopping average of 232 seats, according to 338 Canada. These numbers put them well above the majority line, which will allow them to pass pretty much any legislation they want. The Liberals and NDP, with a more spread out voter base, will receive somewhere between 20 and 50 seats and 15 and 40 seats, respectively. It's hard to know this far out, obviously, but the polls make it clear that the Liberals have a pretty much no chance of winning. Interesting thing you may have noticed is that these projections, they don't show either the Liberal Party or the NDP being guaranteed to be the opposition this next time around. Rather, the Bloc Québécois has a higher chance, taking median numbers, putting the Liberal Party in third, or maybe even fourth place. Obviously, this isn't for sure, because there is some overlap in projections. But if the Liberals win a few ridings in Canada, there's a chance they could overtake the Bloc and remain in second. However, as said before, the median numbers show that it will likely not be the case. The reason this is significant is because since the Bloc may be the leading opposition party in 2025 onward, the issue of Quebec sovereignty will be brought into the forefront of Canada. If this happens, there is a good chance that the Québécois will be pushed further and further along the anti-Canadian road, and a future referendum could result in their secession. This is entirely possible, no doubt about it. And if this did occur, it would have a drastic impact on Canada as a federation. Quebec is often cited as being the deciding factor in Canadian elections. This is because Ontario, half of Canada's population, generally votes one way altogether, and Quebec, as the swing province and the second most populous, is reliably the province which decides on the outcome of general elections. If Quebec left Canada as an independent nation, this would leave Ontario as the controlling province of the entire country. This is significant because there's a definite disconnect between the Plains provinces in Ontario. Ontario and Plains provinces are separated geographically by the desolate Canadian Shield, region of rocky and rugged wilderness. The culture and politics are radically different between the two regions, most likely as a result of this Canadian Shield kind of being a geographical block between the culture of southern Ontario and the culture of Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. Uh, these three provinces have a more like rural, small town, blue collar, middle class population, whereas Ontario is known a lot more for its urban areas and high population density. Um, as you can see on the map on the right, there's a lot more farming in those three provinces there. These provinces already have a sort of isolation from the rest of the country and a potential Quebec independence resulting in Ontarian supremacy would further alienate them. Western alienation is actually a whole topic in itself within Canada, so I won't get too much into it. But an abbreviated point to make is that Quebec's independence would negatively affect the representation of rural Canada very significantly. Another geographical region that would be severely affected by this event would be the Maritime provinces. New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Prince Edward Island have also been historically marginalized by the federal government. There was a time early on where their economic growth was almost completely ignored, and the effects of poverty at the time are still felt. Their geographical separation is also a huge factor. Along with Newfoundland, the Maritime provinces are separated from the rest of Canada by Francophone Quebec. Therefore, if the province achieved independence, the Maritime region they would become similar to like Alaska in the United States, a non-contiguous region. The culture, which is already wildly different than Ontario's, would, I believe, become increasingly alienated and provincially focused, a lot more local, not connected with the rest of Canada. Many people separated from their families would suffer. And one particular group that I believe would suffer is the large population of French speakers in New Brunswick, over 200,000 people who would be nationally separated from their Francophone brethren in Quebec. This and other cultural differences would cause further division in an already marginalized nation. Newfoundland and Labrador, as the newest Canadian province and easily the most isolated, would probably undergo a similar division from the rest of Canada. Newfoundland's extremely unique culture, accent, and geography would be a similar source of contention for them against Ottawa. British Columbia, as the final province I have not spoken of, although it is very distant from Ontario, it does not have nearly as many cultural differences, although I will say they have their own set of problems to deal with because of the Trudeau's government. Now, if the Bloc Québécois opposition does bring Quebec sovereignty into the national spotlight, and they do succeed, and thus create extreme division amongst the provinces, what happens next? Well, there are really four plausible outcomes from this that I can see. First, the nation will remain how it is without Quebec and the provinces, and they try to live how they are. With a nation like the United States, this would work quite well with the rural areas because nationalism and love of country are a very conservative value here. However, Canada is different. Nationalism and love of Canada is most prominent and expressive in urban, liberal, left-leaning regions. Not that the right, or not that the rural areas don't have national or patriotism or nationalism. It's more that it's more prominent in the more left-leaning regions. So, thus, the less left-leaning regions, the Plains provinces in particular, would have much less cultural incentive to remain in the Federation. Therefore, unity might not be as likely as it would be with other nations. Economy also plays a huge factor. The Maritime provinces, as said earlier, will be geographically isolated from the rest of the nation. Possible tariffs from the U.S. or maybe even Quebec could wreck trade income and access to basic imported necessities. Border controls and potential tariffs could slow down and increase shipping prices. The Port of Montreal, a key piece of economic infrastructure, would now be under control of a foreign country, and thus negatively affecting all the industry in the East. The Maritimes would lose so much economic importance to the rest of Canada that it could even cause the shifting of the central ports of Canada over to British Columbia or perhaps even the Hudson Bay. The loss of importance of the Maritimes could probably result in loss of representation representation and role in federal government, all these economic losses would probably combine to make a continued Canadian federation even less feasible. Second possible reaction to Quebec independence would be to increase the sovereignty of the provinces and decrease the influence of the federal government therein. This would be already be a result of the inevitable conservative rule, and this would probably be done to prevent any resentment against Ontario. However, the economic reliance of these provinces on each other would make it difficult to give them more economic freedom. Any exports by Saskatchewan, for example, would need to be done either through Alberta, BC, Manitoba, or Ontario's struggling ports. The other option would be the United States, which is already the historically typical trade partner of Canada. The third possible outcome is that the independence movements could arise within the provinces and most quickly within the Plains provinces, and they would succeed. However, this would probably have the same problems as the previous compromise. The inner provinces would be are landlocked, surrounded by Ontario, BC, and the United States. There's a lot of ways to show this wouldn't work, but it's easiest just to say that the problems of all the other outcomes would remain. Now, the final, obvious, and uncomfortable but interesting outcome would be either an annexation or a secession of the alienated provinces into the United States. It sounds stereotypical and stupid to people hearing this, but it's certainly a very possible and probable outcome. Hear me out. There is no reason other than spite why the provinces in opposition to Ontario would not join the United States, either as incorporated states or as territories. It is economically, politically, culturally, and structurally beneficial to them. Saskatchewan and Alberta in particular align very heavily with the economy of many of the states in the Midwest. Farming, mining, and blue-collar jobs are abundant. There would no longer be that complete disconnect between other areas of the country. The United States is already the biggest trade partner of Canada, and without the Canadian gasoline tax and without American tariffs, importing would become significantly cheaper and more profitable. The maritime provinces, with their fishing and lumber industries, would benefit economically from the United States. We are their immediate neighbors to the south. And the economy of Maine and the culture of Maine is not too dissimilar from theirs. They would have a similar situation as the infrastructure that would be needed to continue being in the Canadian Federation would no longer be necessary, and the trade would be convenient and cheap. The system of the government in the United States would also be beneficial to the new Canadian members. If the provinces were to become states, they would have representation in the federal government far beyond that in their native Canada. The Canadian system, especially after a Quebecit, it's a term I'm coining, by the way, Quebecit. Canadian system, especially after Quebecit, allows for one province to have control over much of the federal government. In the United States, balances in government prevent this from happening, while still giving relative proportional representation to every state. Another political benefit is that most of the new states would be able to keep to be in league with similar states while also keeping a culture of their own. Alberta, for example, is very similar to U.S. states like Montana and North Dakota. However, in joining them in Congress, perhaps to fight a tax that unfairly affects wheat farmers, they would not lose their Alberta-ness. Newfoundland and Labrador is a particularly interesting example. The province has very unique and vibrant culture, and in joining the U.S., that would not necessarily be lost, especially in an age of great cultural respect. That is the 21st century. I think a great example of this happening in the past is Alaska. Since Alaska joined the Union, many of the Native American culture in the North has remained, despite hardships like alcoholism and drug addiction. But their culture has subsisted. Whale hunting, elk clothing, and local customs remain, despite being a nation with many other diverse and wildly different cultures. The Navajo, for example, in New Mexico, their culture remains vibrant, and they get government representation. Final benefit of these Canadian provinces joining the U.S. is that it would be a smooth transition. Yes, Canada and the United States are very similar, almost like siblings. The differences would be very easy to overcome, especially considering the scale of the American government and the vastness of the Canadian job market. I believe it is only too natural, like the admission of Texas. In the 19th century, Texas deemed that it no longer benefited them to be part of Mexico, so they declared independence. Seeing that the best option was the United States, they joined, and within months they were assimilated. This seems to be the sentiment among Canadians. Their government does not serve, among many Canadians, their government does not serve them, and if Quebec leaves, it will only serve them worse. Although America is flawed, deeply flawed, it seems that they could gain from joining the U.S. In a much greater way than any other option after a potential Quebecsit. You may notice that I added 3 Canadian territories to my map of American expansion. Seems like a strange thing, since there's no real reason the Canadian government would give those up. In this age, where America has finished her expansion westward, it doesn't seem to many people that the nation is active in the colonization business anymore. But let's be real. America is America, and oil is oil. For better or for worse, there's no evidence that the United States has finished her journey, only that she has stretched from sea to shining sea. Now that westward expansion is finished, it may be time to move northward. As we head into another Trump presidency and all this talk of 51st state, it shouldn't come as a surprise that if those Canadian provinces join the Union, manifest destiny might just take another bite northward. All right, well, thanks for listening to this. I know it's like kind of stupid, but like it makes sense, you understand why. Spent like way too long on this, but yeah, it's pretty interesting. Also, shout out to Brady for inspiring me to not make this video. Really gave me an incentive here, so I appreciate it. All right, that's all.